Well, good morning, everybody. As just part of my opening moment here, I just want to say how encouraged I am that this is happening. I appreciate Baylor University picking sport as something that we would put under the microscope and really give both academic and a practical look at. Obviously, sport is huge in the American culture today, and yet it continues to be one of the most underserved segments of our society, really, as far as thoughts and how sport works. That's changed in the last few years. My PhD work was an effort to start to think about professional sport fandom in Cleveland, which is where I'm originally from. And there's no shortage of material to look at there. And so I'm just glad that this is happening. Even in the sessions I sat in yesterday, I found so stimulating and challenging, and look forward to continuing that for the rest of the day here. So our guests today, as it turns out, both have a background at ESPN, and it's so interesting because even as we listened to Dr. Smith last night, I thought part of the way that sport has been able to become the idol that it is in our culture today, and that it's actually able to be worshiped, like you can put that word on sport today, is because of ESPN. Because of the 24/7 nature of sports since 1979 and how that's been kept in front of us, whether you like it or not. It's been woven into the psyche of our culture now for the last 30 years in a way that you can actually think about it being a place of worship. And so both of our guests have worked there. Let me introduce them. Lisa Fenn, she's a former feature producer for ESPN, a speaker, and an advocate. She's a graduate of Cornell University, an Edward R. Murrow, and 6-time Emmy Award-winning producer. Among her credits is Carry On, which is a segment that we'll talk about a little bit, but I would highly encourage you to go watch that if you have not already seen it. Carry On was a 2009 production, a documentary hailed as the best story ESPN has ever aired by Sports Illustrated. It's the powerful story of two disabled inner-city young men who overcame incredible hardships to achieve what they thought was impossible. She now speaks to audiences about her experiences and educates on issues of poverty and transracial adoption, as well as continues to work for ESPN as a freelance producer and worker. Put your hands together for Lisa Fenn. Chris Broussard is an internationally known NBA analyst and award-winning journalist for ESPN. As a senior writer for ESPN The Magazine and ESPN.com, he specializes in covering the NBA. He makes regular television appearances on ABC and ESPN and has served as an analyst on the network's flagship NBA show, NBA Countdown. In addition to working with many of America's most accomplished athletes, he has interviewed some of the world's most influential leaders, including former President Bill Clinton and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He's the author of Not Without Scars, the inspiring life journey of Mark C. Olds. Welcome with me, Chris Broussard. So the format will be that both Chris and Lisa will have an opportunity here to share some introductory thoughts, and when that's finished, I'll ask them a few questions, but then really the majority of the time, hopefully, will be questions from you, and so we will have microphones on the side here for you to come up and ask those questions when you have them. Now, Lisa won the toss, if you will, and she deferred to the second half, and so Chris is going to get things started off for us. Chris? Yeah.
Should I? Yeah. Okay. You don't want to get up and stand, right?
I don't know.
Hi, everyone. First of all, before I get started, I'd like to say if anyone watched the Cavaliers-New York Knicks game on Wednesday night, you may see or notice that I have the same suit on that I wore for that game. And I have a good excuse. That's not how I roll. You know, I do have more than one suit, but my flight was delayed from Cleveland to Newark. I live in New Jersey. I meant to rush home, get a new change of clothes, and fly to Dallas and then Waco. But with all the delays, I just had to stay at the airport. So hopefully nobody noticed. It's clean. I ironed it today. Everything should be good. But secondly, I want to thank Baylor University for inviting me here. to speak. I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear myself and Lisa. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, and it's really great to be in an environment where it's a top-level university, but it's also Christian. It was great to see all the books outside in the lobby, and it's just great to be in a place of higher learning where you can feel comfortable sharing your faith and speaking about Christ and things like that. And I would encourage all of you individually and Baylor as an institution as our society goes further and further away from God. I mean, hopefully that trend stops. But if it continues to go that way and get more antagonistic toward Christians, I would encourage you to stay strong and do not buckle and do not give in and compromise on certain essentials because we need individuals and we need a university like Baylor to shine as a light. And so I just would like to offer those words of encouragement to you. As far as my personal faith journey, I was raised Catholic. I grew up going to church every Sunday. My father actually spent a few years studying to become a Catholic priest in high school. I'm very thankful that he didn't go through with it. But even though I was raised Catholic, sports was my God. Sports was my God growing up. I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, my aunt, who was a lawyer, she went on to become a judge. But she asked me one day, she said, "Chris, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a football player." And she said, "If you don't make it as a football player, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "A basketball player." She said, "If you don't make it to the NFL or to the NBA, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a baseball player." You know, so sports was everything to me. Any chance that the teachers gave me when I was growing up to choose my own book to read for class or to write a book report on, I chose a sports book. I read Sports Illustrated religiously growing up. I played football and basketball and baseball in high school. I played basketball in college at Oberlin College. So even though sports was such an integral part of my life, I never really thought deeply about becoming a sports writer until my sophomore year in college. I had, broached the idea, dreamed every once in a while about maybe being a broadcaster, but I really hadn't looked into it in any type of depth. But as a sophomore, I looked around, and a lot of my friends, they all seemed to know what they were doing with their life. One of my fraternity brothers knew he was going to be an engineer. A woman I knew who was a friend, she knew she was going to medical school. Some of my teammates, one knew he was going to law school, another knew he was going to get his MBA. Everyone seemed to know what they wanted to do with their life, and I had no clue. And I got scared. I figured I've got 2 years left before I graduate and have to become a responsible adult and take care of myself. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I came up with a formula. I took something that I enjoyed, which was sports, obviously, plus something that I was gifted at, which was writing. I always was able to write. I mean, everybody can be taught how to write grammatically correct, but to be able to write in a captivating manner, that's a gift, like singing or something else. And I always was able to write. I was young. When I was 9 years old, I started writing rap songs. And that helped me actually write because it taught me how to, tell stories and how to, increase my vocabulary and things like that. I'll spare you a rhyme right now. But I was always a gifted writer. So I said, let me try to become a sports writer. So I started writing articles on the school newspaper, the Oberlin Review. And it wasn't deep investigative journalism by any stretch, because all the articles I wrote were on the basketball team that I played on. So they were far from objective. I remember one story, we had a Midnight Madness, and I wrote the article for the newspaper that week. And I remember I actually wrote the line, Broussard was fearless in penetrating to the basket. You know? And my teammates just crushed me. And my argument is, hey, it was true. It was true. No. But so I didn't have much experience, but that's when I really began looking at sports writing. My sophomore year, I also began dating a young lady who was a Christian. And she was really the first person that I knew closely who introduced me to biblical Christianity. And so as we began dating, we would pray. I was open to praying. And when we would pray, I noticed that when she prayed like she knew God. Like she was praying to her father or her friend. Very personalized, intimate prayers. And all I could pray were memorized prayers. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Like, Hail Mary, full of grace. The memorized prayers I learned growing up Catholic. So that was really my first introduction to biblical Christianity. I went to Bible studies with her. I even fasted, I liked her, so yeah, you want to fast? That's cool, you fast, So she introduced me to the things of the Lord. And one time we went to a church. We had been dating for about a year, and we went to a church, and everybody was excited. I grew up Catholic. I was used to being in very somber church environments, and just really counting the minutes till we could get out of there. But everybody here was excited. The lyrics to the songs everybody was singing were up on the big screen, and it was just really an environment I had never been in for church. And I remember the speaker talked about how he gave his testimony. It was a guest speaker, how he had been addicted to heroin as a teenager, and then he gave his life to Christ when he was about 16 years old and just obviously turned his life around. That was the first time in my life where I really recognized that my life was not right with God. I wasn't right with God, and I needed to give my life to Christ. And as the preacher was giving the altar call, I felt like everybody in that room was looking at me like, you need to go down. You not right with the Lord. The Lord is not pleased with you. And I didn't want to give my life to Christ. So I was literally standing there praying, God, please don't let this man come and pull me out of my seat, because I really didn't want to get saved. I didn't want to repent from the lifestyle that I was living. And so, but I left that church knowing I need to give my life to Christ. And so God still blessed me. That summer going into my senior year, I had an internship at the Cleveland Plain Dealer in sports writing. I did a good job. And they actually liked what I did so much that they told me, look, when you graduate next year, we're going to hire you as a sports writer here at the Plain Dealer. So that was just, you can imagine, those of you who are students here, you can imagine how I felt. That was just awesome to be going into your senior year of college and know that you're going to have a good job, a job that you would enjoy in sports writing when you graduated. It was just great. It was like I had reached the American dream, and that my whole life, that's what I grew up being taught was the purpose of life. Go to school, get good grades, do the best you can so you can go to a good college so you can get a good job when you graduate from college. And when the Plain Dealer told me that, I was just ecstatic for a few days. But then after several days, I began to feel like, is this it? Is this all there is to life? Okay, I've got the American dream right there. I'm on the cusp of it, but there has to be more than this. And I began to feel empty inside. Even though I had so many things going for me. I was going to be a captain on the basketball team that year. I had a girlfriend that I loved, a promise of this great job. When I graduated, I started feeling empty. And I knew it was Christ. I knew it was because I was running from the Lord. But again, I didn't want to repent. I didn't want to stop living the lifestyle I was living. And so to make a long story short, after a few more months of running, God basically broke me down to the point where I was either going to keep running from the Lord and be miserable, or I was going to give my life to Christ and get some peace and some joy. And so, believe it or not, on my 21st birthday, you make a wish over the cake. Instead of making a wish, I actually gave my life to Jesus Christ on my 21st birthday over a cake and candles. So it's been great, and I really don't believe that I would be where I'm at if it weren't for my faith in Christ. I fully believe that God has elevated me and put me on a national platform for me to be a light and to be a witness, whether it's speaking at universities, speaking at churches, speaking at colleges, or whether it's just Christians knowing that there is a man of faith in mainstream society. So I firmly believe that God has elevated me for that reason. Also, I was not, before I gave my life to Christ, I was not much of a public speaker at all. I wasn't a shy person, but when it came to speaking, I was pretty shy speaking in public. And God either poured that into me after I gave my life to Christ, or it was always in me, but it was dormant, and he pulled it out. But for me to speak on national television and speak at some of the biggest churches in the country and universities, I just don't think I would have had that ability, the security, the confidence to do it if I had not given my life to Christ. And finally, the third reason I believe I wouldn't be where I'm at if it weren't for the Lord just blessing me. Sports, as I said, was such an idol in my life that there were times as an athlete in high school when I would let the magnitude of the moment psych me out. If the stage was so big, or even if it wasn't that big, I was just so caught up, and my identity was so caught up in sports and my performance as an athlete that sometimes I know there were games where I was just not able to play to the best of my ability. Even if I still played okay, I wasn't able to perform to the best of my ability because I was caught up in how big the stage was. And that's because sports was an idol to me. Sports was too big in my life. And now sports, including my job, is never the most important thing in my life. It is where it should be. I view it as a gift. I view it as a blessing. I view it as an opportunity from the Lord, but it's never too big. And so I don't get caught up in the magnitude of the moment anymore. I mean, I've covered the NBA Finals for the New York Times and had to write a story that I knew millions of people would read and had to have the story in as soon as the game's over. And I've been able to maintain my composure and be able to do it. I've been on a television show with Magic Johnson for a year, who was sitting right next to Magic, who was one of my childhood heroes when I grew up. And the magnitude of that doesn't get to me because sports is no longer an idol. It's where it should be in my life. And so that's really the way that faith has played a role in my profession and where I'm at now. And it's really guided me along the way. And I'll share a little bit later some other aspects of it with Ed and Lisa. But thank you for your time.
I don't know if you can see me over this podium. Well, I too came to Christ early as a teenager after much back and forth and negotiation with God, much like Chris. I think we have kind of similar testimonies in that part. But I came to Christ at the age of 17, and a year later I went to Cornell University, where I played softball, and I was actually discipled by Athletes in Action, so I was excited, Ed, that you were going to be here today. Athletes in Action really taught me how to articulate what I believe and why I believe it, and they also taught me how to incorporate my love of sports with my love of Christ. I went on 2 softball outreach missions with them to Russia and the Czech Republic. I spent a year in Australia working with them, speaking publicly about my faith in the major cities and in the deepest recesses of the outback. And those trips were really cementing for me and my faith. I remember one pivotal moment came during our debriefing from our Russia trip. And the Athletes in Action leader said, I know you're all on a spiritual high right now. We had experienced some really amazing things as new Christians. And she said, remember this moment, because if I were to look into a crystal ball 20 years from now, only 1 in 4 of you would be passionately still walking with Christ. She said, statistically, that's what the research showed, and that was startling to me. And I remember going back to my hotel room that night and getting on my knees and saying, Lord, I will be that one. And over the years, as I've walked through some dark times, as I've had doubts, I've often gone back to that moment and what that AIA leader said, and I've leaned on that promise that I made. And this past summer marked 20 years. It was also on these trips that I decided that I was going to be a missionary. I really wanted to dedicate myself to taking hope to the hardest places of the world. And then I ended up in professional sports, which is arguably one of the more lavish subcultures in the world. So I guess God has quite a sense of humor. In many ways, taking the job at ESPN was sort of a divine miracle in and of itself. I thought I'd graduate from college, get a job writing for a while, pay off some loans, and raise money to go to the mission field. But I couldn't find a job writing. And a friend recommended I check out the production assistant program at ESPN, and I thought, well, that sounds fun. I like sports. I like the theater of sports. I don't own a jersey or have a fantasy team. I'm not that level. So I went, and the interview was conducted by a man who spoke in a low, monotone voice, and kept his eyes sort of fixed on the ground the whole time. He told me he was going to ask me 10 questions, and then he proceeded to do just that. And he said, who's the backup catcher for the Astros? I said, I don't know. Name the offensive line for the Cincinnati Bengals. I don't really like football that much. Who won the Vezina Trophy last year? What's a Vezina Trophy? Name the starting 5 for the San Diego Padres. Sterling, Hitchcock, Trevor, Hoffman closes. Best 6th man in the NBA. It was getting worse and worse. So he said he was going to ask me 10, but by my count, he enacted the mercy rule after 8 and put me out of my misery. And he said, thank you for your time. If he's still not looking at me, he said, thank you for your time. If anything opens up, we will give you a call unless there's anything you'd like to add. I said, there is something I'd like to add because I'm quite certain my phone will never ring. And I said, well, your questions, I get the importance of them. Really, I could have looked all those things up in a book, or actually at that time I don't think we had the internet. But you've done nothing today to sort of get to the heart of my work ethic, my creativity, my writing abilities. All you've done is sort of proven that I'd be terrible at barroom sports trivia. And and he continued looking off to the side, and he said, is there anything else? And I said, yeah, there is something else. I was growing fearless, or foolish, depending how you look at it. I said, I've paid good money to fly all the way up here, and you haven't once looked me in the eye. That's kind of rude. And then he looked me in the eye, and I wished he hadn't. And he said, can you start in 2 weeks? And I said, what? He said, well, you have a bit of, shall we say, spunk. And he said, I've noticed that goes far here. And that was it. I walked out, my knees were buckling. He said his secretary would give me a call. And I remember going to my car, and I walked past this stone sign that was about as tall as I was, and it said, ESPN Worldwide Leader, and it kind of felt like my David and Goliath moment. But fortunately, those few stones of spunk I had in my satchel turned out to be enough. So for my first 6 years at ESPN, I covered baseball exclusively, the one sport I actually did know a lot about, even if I couldn't name the Padres starting rotation. And so every spring I spent 6 weeks in Florida and Arizona doing team previews. Each week of the season I was at a different stadium featuring a different player for Baseball Tonight. I hit the road for the whole month of October covering playoffs as a producer for Peter Gammons and Tim Kirkjian. And most of my stories were very sports specific, the success of the A's starting rotation or Pat Burrell's hit streak, things like that. And I have to say it was probably the most fun I think I've ever had in my life, more fun than anyone should ever have at work. But as time went on, it was clear that I was kind of getting farther away from my calling as a missionary, what I thought was my calling as a missionary. In a way, it was the complete opposite. I mean, it was excess versus austerity and dominance versus peace and all the things that were contrary to what I thought that I would do. And I was starting to crave stories with more substance. And around that time, and it was 2003, ESPN decided to start a features unit that was dedicated to telling longer form stories designed to reveal and inspire. And I was one of the first 6 producers sort of tapped to start that unit, and I was the only female, and I was quickly sort of dubbed as the girl who would make you cry on Sunday night Sports Center. So my first story was about then a little-known high school basketball player in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, named Chris Paul. Chris was a high school senior. He came from a Bible-believing family, and his grandfather, Nathaniel, was the rock of his family. Nathaniel never missed a game until one day when he would miss them all, because Nathaniel was bludgeoned to death in his driveway in broad daylight by 5 teenagers after his empty wallet. No one expected Chris to play in his next game a few days later, but Chris decided to play. And I brought along a little video clip to show you what happened in that game.
Never would.
Still grieving days later, Chris seized on a plan to honor his grandfather in his next game by scoring 1 point for every year of his grandfather's life, all 61 of them.
The first thought was, how can I go out there on that court knowing my granddad's not there? And my aunt mentioned before I went to the Parkland game, she said, how about 61 points for your granddad? And I just thought to myself, that would be lovely. And I just thought to myself, ain't no way I could do that.
But staying within the flow of the game, without most people, including his parents, knowing what he had planned, Chris scored 24 points in the second quarter alone.
Now, this is one of the times that I just felt there's no way that, I don't care what kind of defense you play, who you put in front of me, there's no way you're gonna stop me from getting to that goal. The whole game I was just thinking about my granddad, just thinking, he's in heaven, he's watching this game. He's watching this game. Every time somebody hits me to the floor, he's up there jumping out of his seat, getting angry. And then as the course of the game went on, I said, I can do this.
By the end of the third quarter, West Forsyth had the game wrapped up. Word began to spread through the crowd about Chris's remarkable tribute.
I think I heard some of the children talking about it, but I didn't believe it. I mean, 61 points, come on. That's just almost unreal. So I didn't believe it.
Coach asked me how many did he need. I'm like, what? And he looked at me like, don't you know? And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, nothing.
There towards the end, when we got to 56, they turned around, one of the kids turned around and said, Miss Polly only needs 5, and that's when I started getting nervous, because I really wanted him to achieve it at that point.
With less than 2 minutes to go in the game, Chris had scored 59 points. Then he drove to the hoop, took a hard foul, and the shot dropped. He had his 61.
And I laid it up, and I got fouled, and it went in. And I laid there for a second and was just overwhelmed, because I knew that at this moment in time, this is something I'll never forget. It felt like I could have just died and went to heaven right there. It felt like my purpose for being here was almost over.
His total left him just 6 points away from the state record for most points in a game. But as he walked to the foul line, that didn't matter. 61 did.
I walked to the free throw line, the referee gave me the ball and shot an air ball right out of bounds. And my coach took me out. I just looked at my dad and started crying.
It's like everything came out of him. He just walked over to me and gave me a hug, and he just fell in my arms. And that's when it just tore me up, because of what he had just done.
It's one thing, I think, to talk about it, but it's another thing to do it and to achieve it, you know. Yeah, my sister had talked to him about it, but for him to be able to go out there with that in mind, I want to do this for my grandfather, for my best friend, and to be able to achieve it, that's just...
I believe it makes me stronger, but it's so hard because we're still getting through it now. My granddad did so much for our family that it's unreal. It's hard to go on right now. I'm thankful for my granddad.
So Chris Connolly and I got to go to Winston-Salem and interview Chris and his family a few days after that game. They were still grieving, and yet I was really just touched by the dignity with which they displayed in the midst of this tragedy. And after our camera crews wrapped up and went home and Chris Connolly went back to the airport, I sort of hung back with the Paul family to talk some more, and they shared some pictures from Chris's childhood, and they shared pictures of their beloved Nathaniel, and they shared more stories. And before I left, we prayed together. We prayed for healthy grieving. We prayed for justice in court. And I went home just really invigorated by this new sort of by this tender connection that I had with them, something that I hadn't been able to experience in my 6 years of covering baseball. A few weeks later, our story aired on ESPN, and shortly thereafter, the Paul family called me to thank me for preserving their memory in such an artful way, and also to tell me that thanks in part to the media coverage, the judge had granted their request to try these 5 17-year-olds who had murdered their grandfather as adults. And so there was some justice done there in their mind that was special. A few months later, I won my first Emmy Award for this story on Chris, and my first phone call from the ceremony lobby was to Chris, who sounded just as excited as I was, and in no way did the recognition reduce the grief, but together we kind of felt like we had achieved one more thing for Granddad. And as Chris went on to star at Wake Forest University, he was the 4th pick in the 2005 draft. He's won Olympic gold. He stars for the LA Clippers now, and yet every time I would see him around, I would say, "Hey there, little Chris Paul." And he would say, "Hope you're still praying for me, Miss Lisa." And I do. I definitely do. And so from that story, it was clear to me that there was room for the intersection of faith and sports, that even though I worked for ESPN, God was clearly doling out my assignments. I've produced more than 200 features for ESPN, and it's almost always been clear to me where God is at work at either the lives of my story subjects or in the lives of the viewers who see them. I've done stories on families who are battling life-altering illnesses, athletes who contemplated suicide, high schoolers who lost teammates in tragic ways, people who have leaned on their faith, people who have lost their faith. And I feel so fortunate to be part of their private pains and their sacred celebrations. And I think one thing that's really unique about my job that allows for these relationships to happen is sort of the cunning use of the camera. The camera is very personal. And when I go into someone's home and I set up hot lights and I put a camera on them and I ask them deep questions about their most personal experiences, it leads to this sort of accelerated vulnerability. And then and they realized how life-giving that sharing is. Talking is like oxygen to them. And so when the lights go off and the camera crews go home, they want to share more. And I'm fortunate to be the one left there to lend that ear. And as a result, I very often, more often than not, have opportunities to develop long-term relationships with my story subjects, to pray with them, to help when help is required. And so that is the way that I see my faith intersecting with my subjects. And then when it comes to viewers, I think I'm in a really unique position in sports in that I have anywhere from 3 to 30 minutes to tell a story, depending on what it requires. And this is invaluable real estate in sports television. I can convey things through a story that you can't do in other realms of sport, because I'm not limited to a few sound bites and 3 plays from a game. I have time to sort of develop these pockets of vulnerability where people can reflect on truths, where they can ask questions about how they might respond in a situation or who they want to be. The highlights I'm most interested are in highlights of love, of grace, of redemption, of hope. And I feel like my job gives me that platform to sort of reveal those truths to people. And because people are drawn to the power of sports, that we share that connection, and sports fans are the most passionate people you'll ever meet on this planet, I can connect in that way and command quite an audience, which is a really special and unique part of what I do. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Lisa. So, why don't we jump off on a positive note then? Because so many of the questions that we have here actually have to do with the challenges of faith within the media. And yet, Lisa, you really just sort of framed your job as a ministry with what you just did as the last 5 minutes. So let's just continue with that. Because one of the questions that we have here are, what are some positive ways that media has been able to present or portray athletes' faith? So again, you just gave us one, Lisa. Chris, your work is actually more almost in news reporting. You've done some longer form stuff, but you find yourself with not as much room to even tell an elongated story. So how would you respond to that? What are some ways that media can positively portray an athlete's faith?
Well, I think Lisa just showed the best way. I mean, she's done some features that are just tremendous. A feature like that on Chris Paul, I mean, the impact that had on society and individuals, I mean, we don't know how big that impact was. So that's great. You know, we've seen other things like that. I remember there was a feature, I don't know if it was 60 Minutes but they did something on Dwight Howard when he was in high school, and he was a Christian, and he wanted to put the cross over the NBA logo. And that was his goal, his dream. So that was an example. I mean, I've seen stories on Mark Jackson and his faith. There was a 30 for 30 recently on Bill McCartney that I didn't see, but people told me really they were surprised that they allowed him to speak so openly about his faith. Brian Bosworth, remember the Boz? He's a Christian now, and they did his 30 for 30, which was a great piece. So it's interesting. I think those are all ways, obviously, writing feature stories. With me, sometimes my editors have been skeptical. I've done a few stories on faith, but sometimes some of my editors have felt like I had an agenda as a Christian, you know, to promote these types of stories. So a lot of times they've wanted me to do a different type of story. I remember I was sent out to do a story on Michael Redd for ESPN, the magazine. He was a really strong Christian. And there were some great anecdotes that he gave me because I was a Christian and I could relate to what he was saying. I was able to get a lot of great stuff out of him. I mean, just all the temptations that he would face. You know, when he gets to a hotel on the road, there's 6 phone calls for him from women he doesn't even know. And you're cute. You don't know me, but I like to meet. Or women coming to his house drunk at 2 a.m. And just how he would overcome those temptations and lived in the NBA celibate for like 3.5 years until he got married. And I thought there were anecdotes that I know they would eat up in a different, if it were maybe promoting something else. But they wanted a story that was a little more focused on just his basketball and things like that. So I felt that was like maybe an instance where if they didn't know I was a Christian, maybe they would have they would have had it done. But they kind of feel like sometimes I had an agenda. But so yeah, that's my answer. Lisa?
Yeah, I don't. I know in my time at ESPN, we never overtly did stories of faith. So and so is a Christian. If I had said, I'm going to follow Kurt Warner to church for a Sunday, and that's my story, they would have said, no, you're not. And I think that one thing that, but when relevant, I fought really hard, like Chris, to include it in their story, to be truthful and authentic to who these people are and what drives them. And I know that I too faced resistance. I think in part a lot of my managers had kind of grown numb from hearing athletes in post-game interviews say, thanking Jesus Christ, their Lord and Savior, and then getting in a nightclub brawl. And so they didn't want to get caught in a spot, where we present someone as walking the straight path, only to find out that they're not. And so one example of this of where I had to fight came in a story that I did many years ago called The Baseball Grannies. And it was about these 6 grandmothers in an impoverished backwoods town in South Carolina who wanted to give kids something productive to do to keep them off the streets. And so they decided to start a Little League team. And they got bats and gloves donated. They got T-shirts printed. They got people to clean up this overgrown field. And then they realized they had one big problem. They didn't know a thing about baseball. And so this clip I'm going to show you now, it's much shorter than the first one, but here's what they did.
Grandmothers. Who can say no to grandmother?
But none of the grandmothers knew anyone who could teach the game. So the baseball grannies gathered on the field and appealed to a higher power.
We literally prayed for coach. We stood around in a little circle and we prayed for coach.
Then one night, a truck driver named Daniel Demery saw a local news story about the grandmothers.
The next day, I think it was, I came out with some balls and I brought a few more things with me. And one of the ladies said, well, you know what we need most of all? We need a coach, we need some help.
Daniel Demery became the answer to the grandmother's prayer.
I just made it my intention to work around my schedule to be able to help out with them. I just thank them for praying, and I thank God for sending me there.
So that was in the middle of the feature, and ESPN my managers wanted me to take that entire section out of my script. They told me that Southern women praying was cliche. And I said, I think it's a lot more compelling than a couple nice people randomly bumped into each other. But they said, no, it was cliche. And I said, if we are asking people to position themselves as role models, then we're forced to ask what motivates them, what drives them. And who are we to say that their answer is incorrect? I mean, you're good enough to put on TV, but we're going to tell you that all of your reasonings are wrong. I said, I think that completely oversteps our editorial jurisdiction. And so in this case, and in several others, like Chris, I had people tell me, well, you probably shouldn't have been assigned to this story because as a Christian, you're biased towards stories of faith. And I said, well, okay, but the flip is true too. If you send someone who's not of faith, they're biased in the other direction. So that argument is kind of a push, and we're back to square one. What else have you got? And they didn't really have anything else. And so I said, you hire former football players to report on football because they have inside knowledge of the game. You don't tell them that their knowledge is a detriment. They understand football, so they're assigned to football. Chris's knowledge of basketball makes him an asset in the basketball arena. We don't send him to cover the NHL. And so, maybe they do, I don't know. Okay.
Thankfully.
So similarly, it makes sense that you would send a person of faith to cover others of faith because we understand how they work. So in this case, I won, or I was at least appeased.
Well, what do they say back to that? Do you remember? Like, what's the next step in that dialogue?
Like, I got to take this call, get out of my office. I mean, it's never a resolution like, oh wow, you're right. But I suppose I was acknowledged as right because the shot stayed, or I at least had the stamina to keep fighting. And so a lot of my feature stories, include people living out their faith, living out the love, the sacrifice, the hope of Christ, and getting these things on the air for me is a win. Because even though they might seem like a few small, forgettable moments of cable television, if you were to read the viewer responses that I get after these stories air, you'd see that they matter, that they have a ripple effect, that they make people think and ground themselves. So that's what I tried hard to fight for when it was relevant.
So, Chris, you introduced the idea of having an agenda, okay, which is behind some of this. And yet the reality is, as a Christian person in that arena, you may find yourself having an agenda at times, and yet you know you don't want to be seen that way. You don't want to be portrayed as just being sort of an extension of the local church in your job. And so this crowd even here, you know, is familiar with the language of power also. So you both find yourselves in positions of power and influence. You don't run the company, but relative to the rest of us, you have a platform to tell someone's story, and you have a responsibility to do something right with it, but you also feel the tension of being a Christian in that environment. So how do you navigate all that? What is your responsibility as a Christian given the position of power that you have?
Well, I mean, at my job, I just feel like my responsibility, to be honest, is, as far as a Christian, is to live the gospel rather than, I mean, I'm not preaching to people at my office and things like that. I just want to try to carry myself with integrity. They know I'm a Christian so that when they look at my life, they can see the light, I guess. You know, and part of that, like I recently, this past summer, I made a mistake. It was with Mark Cuban, the Dallas Mavericks owner. I had tweeted when DeAndre Jordan was, you know, deciding between the Mavericks and the Clippers and all that. And I got some, you know, pretty interesting information that Mark Cuban couldn't find DeAndre's house, and that he was talking to family members trying to find the house. And so I just tweeted it out, not thinking it was even really a big deal. I didn't send it into the desk to write a story about it. I just say, oh, this is a little interesting anecdote, you know. So I just tweeted out, and he, you know, went ballistic and really fought denying it and everything. And so a couple days later, he and I were going back and forth. A couple days later, I released a statement saying that not that the information was wrong, but that I should have contacted him first for his view on it, you know, and I took it like, you know what, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Now, he wanted me to retract the story or the tweet, whatever it was. And I told him, I was like, look, until my sources tell me, he was like, why don't you just say that they said they were wrong? You know, they were misled. I said, they didn't tell me that. They didn't tell me they were misinformed. So I'm not going to retract that. And he and I just went back and forth in a conversation with it, and he let it go, and I think he respected that. But I said, I will admit that I should have, you know, contacted you first. Again, thinking it was a tweet, it didn't seem like a big deal, but, you know, Twitter's bigger than sometimes we think. So I felt like, you know what, if I was wrong, I was wrong. And I'm not going to let ego get in the way, and I'll admit it. And I think that's part of my responsibility as a Christian, is just to try to carry myself with integrity and admit you're wrong if you're wrong. And so with stories, I mean, I obviously I love to see guys talk about their faith in a story. And if it's appropriate, you know, I'll definitely try to incorporate that. But I don't, you know, with what I do, you know, with the type of coverage that I provide in reporting, it really, an agenda can't really come into play, you know. So I don't know if I answered that well, but that's kind of how it is.
Lisa, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree with Chris in that when I think of my first priority in my career, it's that I'm committed to excellence in journalism and in storytelling, because if you're not doing your job at top level, nobody's going to respect what you think about anything else anyway. Mm-hmm. And so my first priority is achieving excellence in my storytelling, accuracy, and where I can, I want to use that as delivering a source of hope and love to my story subjects and to my audience. I love telling stories that sort of reflect God's larger story, which is his patient, redemptive pursuit of his people. I also another thing I loved about feature reporting and telling these sort of inspirational stories was that I felt like it was a good counter to the bad news culture that we live in.
Yeah.
CNN did a really good print piece earlier this week on mass shootings and the copycat effect, and how media coverage can sometimes turn these killers into celebrities. And the piece said that wherever 4 or more people are slayed or killed at one time, the likelihood significantly and statistically increases that a similar attack will be at least attempted within 2 weeks, because we prey on this copycat effect. And so I loved that I kind of saw part of my mission as countering this, because I feel like love and hope and resilience can also be contagious when they're put out there in the correct way. How I do that is different with every assignment. In my job, every day is different. If I'm working on a story for a month, I could be researching one day, organizing logistics another day, traveling, interviewing, shooting, writing, editing, scoring music, everything from nuts to bolts. I like that variety. And so, in part, I never know what to expect on a given day, and so I just sort of leave the house, and I would say every day, Lord, show me where you are at work and use me where you can. And that was my agenda for the day. And as I kind of started by saying I thought I would be a missionary, and I don't consider myself a missionary now, but he's definitely showed me that there can be a ministry within sports media and really any profession you choose.
We probably could make an argument that you're a missionary as well, but that's not what we're here to do. It's good.
Working much harder in much worse places.
Yeah, they are. Jason, can we bring those mics up? Okay, so as the mics are coming up, if you have a question, you can come up. And, I'll throw this out to both of you as people are coming to ask other questions. And so, Chris, I'll actually use you and what's happened with you in the last couple of years. You came to the forefront and got people's attention when you responded to Jason Collins coming out as the first gay player on a current NBA roster, and he had associated his coming out with his Christian faith, and you took issue with that, and you on a talk show said that you disagreed with that. You didn't think that it was possible to do that. So the point here is not to discuss what we think about gay people on rosters or whether they can be Christians or not, because I know we're all in different places probably in this room about that, but what stood out to me about that is your willingness to have a different viewpoint, which kind of goes against the party line, if you will. And really, Lisa, again, you've already done that in the stories that you've shared, but talk about that a little bit. Talk about the tension when you have a viewpoint that is contrary to what you know is perhaps the most accepted viewpoint in the office. Talk about standing up, or how you make decisions about when you're going to stand up to do that. Because you could have been fired for that. Probably should have been, in light of how lots of people get handled in those situations.
Slow down.
But could have been, and you knew that before you stood, you knew that.
Well, the reason they had me on the show, it was Outside the Lines, was back in 2007. And Jason Collins came out in 2013. In 2007, John Amaechi came out. He was a professional player in the NBA, and he had retired, and then he announced a few years after his retirement that he was a homosexual. And I covered John actually when he was in Cleveland with the Cavaliers and knew him fairly well. But I noticed I was not planning on writing about it or anything. And I noticed that the coverage, though, anytime like an NBA player, like they would be asked about it, and a player might say, well, it's all right for him, but just as long as he doesn't bring it toward me, or something like that. And the media members would just pounce on guys for just saying, not even insulting him, but just saying that they don't agree with it or they would be uncomfortable with it, whatever their viewpoint was. And all the media coverage that I was reading and seeing on television was saying that people that didn't agree with that we're Neanderthals, we're idiots, we're, backwards, and just very insulting. And so I wrote a blog. It was just a blog on ESPN.com saying that, stating that I was a Christian and I didn't believe in same-sex marriage and homosexuality and foreign premarital sex between heterosexuals and drunkenness and so on and so forth, that I believe those things were sins. And the point of the article was that we are a diverse society. And part of diversity is not is accepting viewpoints that are different from your own. And I use it as an example. LZ Granderson was the associate editor of the NBA department at ESPN the magazine when I was there, and he's openly gay. And he and I were good friends when I worked there. We played on several basketball teams together. We hung out. We'd have lunch together. I mean, we were friends, even though I knew his lifestyle and he was open about it, and he knew my viewpoints as a Christian, and we would actually discuss our differences and things like that. And so I wrote that article in 2007, and 90% of the response was positive. And this was thousands of letters I got about it. Even from homosexuals, they said, we loved, we didn't agree with you, but we loved the fact that it was cordial and it was civil. And you just talked about how we have to accept each other for who they are, regardless of, what their lifestyle or what their beliefs are. And they actually liked it so much at ESPN that Mike and Mike, which is the most popular sports talk show in the country, or at least was at that time, they read it on the air. And so that was a positive response to the same thing. So fast forward 6 years, in 2013, they bring me on Outside the Lines with LZ Granderson. And some people think, well, they set you up. I don't think they set us up. I think they thought it would be a really good show, and they knew our friendship and they knew our differences. Now, before that show, I had been on SportsCenter maybe 3 or 4 times, just speaking as an objective reporter. They were just asking me, what are people around the league saying, so on and so forth. And I was keeping my own opinion out of it and sharing, what guys around the league were saying. Most of it was positive. There was some dissent, but I was saying most guys in the league, said they'd be fine with him as a teammate and so on and so forth. So I go on Outside the Lines. I don't even know LZ's going to be on there, which is not unusual. Usually I don't know who the other guests are until I sit down in the chair and we begin saying hi to each other in our earpieces. So I found out LZ was going on. I said, well, this is going to be interesting, And so, again, Outside the Lines is a show where a lot of times you're able to inject your opinion. In fact, that's why they have you on there sometimes. If I were to inject, and I think at times I have been on there when I injected my opinion as an African-American, and that's good. They like that. I know they had a show on Outside the Lines. They talked about the N-word, and they want your personal perspective on the N-word. So I didn't know what we were going to, I knew we were going to talk about Jason, but I didn't know if it was going to get to a point where I could inject my personal views or not, but I was ready either way. So LZ, he's talking, and he brings up on the air someone had asked him about a football player, Mike Wallace, who had tweeted something like, all these beautiful women in the world and dudes want to sleep with dudes, something like that. And so they asked LZ about it, and LZ talked about it, and then he said, in fairness, and he said in full disclosure, Chris and I have had these discussions, and we disagree, but we're able to do it, without getting upset with one another. And so I actually felt a responsibility to share. Okay, he's put it out there. I don't know what the viewers don't necessarily know what my views are on this topic. So I felt like I should share what my viewpoint is. And I just said, I'm a Christian. I'm don't believe in same-sex marriage and so on and so forth. And but I talked about how LZ and I could have these conversations about the topic without being insulting and still maintaining a good relationship. And then the host asked me, he said, well, Jason Collins, in his article about coming out, he claimed to be a Christian. What do you think about that? And that's where I gave my article, my answer, that, well, I don't believe you can live, essentially what I said was, I don't believe you can live in unrepentant sin and be a Christian. And not just homosexuals, and I said this, fornication, adultery, whatever it might be. I said, I don't see biblical evidence for that. So that was really it. Now, after the show, ESPN calls me maybe 30 minutes later, one of our top executives, and I thought he was going to be upset. And he said, oh, that was great. We're trying to figure out how we're going to use you in our shows later in the day. Like, do we want you to just be an objective reporter, or do we want you to offer your commentary? And I said, well, either way, I'm fine. I can do whatever you want in that regard. And then maybe an hour later is when the firestorm hit on the internet and everything and television, and they decided, we just won't use you tonight. So, but I got a text from one of the, someone at ESPN, high ranking. You would know him. I won't give his name, but you would know him. But he said that was a great show. You guys talked about a hot button topic. You had really the two most prominent views in the country right now on this topic, and you were able to discuss it without being accusatory, without insulting one another, and discuss it respectfully. And so a lot of people really liked it, and I think that's what they thought when they put us both on the show, that this will be compelling television. I don't think they were prepared for the backlash. But people ask me all the time, do you have any regrets? I ain't have any regrets. And I mean, I just felt like it was surprising to be asked that directly, a question about that really I felt was about biblical faith on television, on a sports station. But I just felt like, I felt good about it. I felt like I shared my opinion in love, or my viewpoint in love, with compassion, and was not, my heart was in the right place, and I felt like I was true to the scripture. So I didn't have any problem with it. And to ESPN's credit, now I don't know what they were saying behind closed doors, but to me, they never gave me any indication that they were displeased with me. No hint of a firing or a suspension or anything like that. They asked me to put out a statement, and I told them, I said, I'm not going to apologize. And they said, no, we don't expect you to, and we don't want you to, we're not even asking that. But just a statement of clarification about your ability to continue covering the NBA and so on and so forth. So I did that, and I actually spoke to Jason Collins a couple of days later. Might have been a day later. And we had a good 10-minute conversation. I stated on the show, it had nothing to do with ever believing he shouldn't be able to play in the NBA or have a livelihood or anything like that. And he understood that. And when I see him, we're fine. I see his brother, who's a coach with the Golden State Warriors, we're fine. But the media coverage was very bad. Mm-hmm. They wrote like I singled out homosexuality when I didn't. I mentioned several types of sin. And they, of course, they start quoting Leviticus, but none of the New Testament and stuff. All of a sudden these columnists become Bible scholars, And good friends of mine have ripped me, But look, as a Christian, I don't expect everybody to agree with what I believe, So I understood that that's how it is, and I was prepared for it. But, that's how it was.
Good. Lisa, how do you decide? And you've already given us examples. How do you decide when you're going to inject your own opinion, your own perspective into a story?
I'm behind the camera, so no one ever asked me for a public statement on anything.
It's different. It is different.
So I sort of just choose my moments internally and know who I can have conversations with and who I can't. As Chris was talking, I was trying to think back in my career if there were any moments where I did have to take a stand for things. two of the smaller ones that came to mind was when I first started covering baseball. I was a newbie producer, and Ken Griffey Jr. had been traded from the Mariners to the Cincinnati Reds. I don't know if he had already been there a year or not, but I think it was my first year in spring training, and it was early in the season, and they wanted me to go into the Reds clubhouse. They'd heard a rumor that he had become a clubhouse cancer. I mean, spring training just started, so how bad could it be? But they wanted me to go in and ask players with him in there, is Ken Griffey Jr. a clubhouse cancer? And I said, I don't know that that's the best approach. Like, I'm not interested in creating controversy. If somebody has said something, I'd be happy to ask them about it, but I don't really want to go and start stoking a fire. And my manager at the time was not the most tender man. And so he said, you got to do it or I'm bringing you home, essentially. You're out of there. So I remember standing outside the clubhouse and praying to myself and like, Lord, how are you going to get me out of this one? And they wanted me to interview Ken Griffey Jr. about it primarily. And that just sounded like I'd rather stick a fork in my eye. So I went into the clubhouse. I found the media director. I said, has Griffey come yet? And he said, oh, he's got the flu. He stayed home today. So I was out of there. So that was one instance where God really got me out of it. But as I sort of grew in my reputation, I was able to be a little more forceful. I remember one story I had to do on Ray Lewis's leadership on the Ravens. So several years after the murder accusations. And it was, I want to say it was like a Friday night, but I was in Ray Lewis's house with the camera crew waiting for Michael Irving to arrive from Dallas to do the interview. He, for whatever reason, didn't have a GPS and was driving around Baltimore for 2 hours while I was sitting there waiting for him. And Ray had a group of 4 or 5 friends in the kitchen. I was in the living room, he was in the kitchen, and they're kind of scary dudes. And I could overhear them talking about all sorts of horrible things they planned to do to women that night, and there were firearms in the kitchen, and I really didn't feel safe at all. And was not at all impressed with the language he was using, considered I was there to do a piece on his leadership abilities. So Michael finally arrived. We all lived to tell about it, but I took the tapes back to Bristol, and I said, I shot this, but I'm not editing it. I said, I refuse to be the person who presents him as a role model on the network. Here's the tapes, do what you want, but these were my experiences, and I'm done with this story. And they didn't make me edit it. That was that.
Lisa brought up a great point, like in your story about Ken Griffey Jr., because that's something I struggle with now, because a lot of what I deal with now as an NBA reporter, a lot of times I feel like I may be trafficking in gossip. Yeah, I'm going to be honest. And it's something I battle with, struggle with, don't enjoy. I mean, if you read an NBA story today, 90% of the quotes are anonymous. And most of my stuff is anonymous. And I'm trying to really figure out how to deal with a lot of that. I've dealt with it now. I've been doing it for a few years. It's become like this. But I think to a certain degree, tabloid journalism is becoming the norm. And because people will say stuff off the record that they won't say on the record. And the stuff is salacious and it's sensational and it makes for interesting stories. But it's just something that is a challenge for you if you're a person that, has some questions about whether or not that should be being done. That really
I
struck
totally
home.
agree, because we've fallen into this narrative where we like these stories of this meteoric rise to fame. We give them lots of money and attention and celebrity, and then we sensationalize their fall. And we watch this sort of quick story arc in a depraved sort of way. We expect it. We follow them around with cameras. We prey upon it. And when a Johnny Manziel or a Tiger Woods screws up, it's 24-hour wall-to-wall coverage of their mistakes. And I get that an athlete needs to be held accountable, but I think if a media outlet's being honest, it's more about ratings than anything else. Because if we were truly interested in their accountability, we would cover their recovery with the same vigor that we cover their fall. And that always that was one of the reasons I really liked feature reporting, because I prefer the redemptive narrative over sort of the tragic narrative. I like to develop those arcs of renewal to counteract the sensationalistic, sort of fall. So I agree with Chris on that, definitely.
Excellent. Are there questions that you have? I'm assuming that there are, but nobody's standing at these mics. So I have other questions, but now is the time to come up and use the mics.
I have anything else to say?
Go ahead over here to the left.
Hey, I'm Ian Maupin from Union University. Is this on? Okay, cool. So just a question mostly for Lisa, but both of you can answer. You mentioned how there's a lot of people are jaded by the hypocrisy of a lot of players saying, oh, God gave me this victory, and then getting in a fight at a club or something. Do you think that the amount of media coverage that these players have makes it easier for them to be hypocritical or harder, or how do you think that affects it?
Do I think the amount of media coverage, say the last part again?
That these players receive makes it easier or harder or affects the level of hypocrisy that they can engage in?
Well, I think it might be more the function of editing that contributes to hypocrisy, because everything is reduced to a soundbite and to a moment that lives in perpetuity. And as a culture, our eyes always go to the crack in a person's armor, and so it doesn't lend itself to examining the whole of a person, to the complexities of human nature, to realize that when we see an athlete have a moment of hypocrisy, or we see them fall, it conveniently gets reduced to, oh, he couldn't handle the pressure, he's an idiot, he's a bum. And that's a conclusion that most sports fans are comfortable with, because it makes them feel better about themselves. They're not forced to examine their own human condition and how they might respond in those temptations, and how the universal need for grace exists. So, yeah, I kind of blame the soundbite culture for that, at least in television. I think in print there's more opportunity to develop a longer arc.
Yeah, and I do think that the 24-hour, 24/7 nature of coverage today does add to, because nothing these athletes do is off the record anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, LeBron James, if he does anything, it can be reported. I mean, people feel free to report on if they see him out with his family. Yeah, we saw this summer, he was out meeting with Kevin Love at a pool. Before Kevin Love signed. It was just a regular person who was at the pool, filmed it and tweeted it, So their whole lives are under scrutiny. And I think many of us, or if not all of us, we've had moments, even as Christians, where we did something, said something where if you just, like Lisa said, if you just show that one moment in time out of context or even in context or whatever, it might look like, oh, yeah, they say they love Jesus, but look at that, And so I think that's a big part of it. I mean, their lives are completely in a fishbowl now. And so that makes it easier in that regard.
Good question, Ethan.
Thank you.
How about over here?
So I'm a native of Northeast Ohio, and so I have grown up a long-suffering Browns fan. So perhaps we can talk after the panel. I also teach at Denison University, and we have great affection for Oberlin, Chris.
No, you don't.
But we think we're a better school. And among the reasons we think we're better, of course, is because one of our alums is George Bodenheimer, the founder of ESPN.
Right.
So my question is this. I'm pulling at this thread of the soundbite culture in which we live, how pervasive that's become, how insidious the stories are we seem to tell about sports, the invective that informs those stories, the salacious that informs those stories. Are you hopeful going forward that there will continue to be space for stories of redemption and hope and grace? Because everything seems to push against those values to which each of you have committed your professional lives. And I'm grateful for your example, but the larger landscape seems pretty bleak. So are you hopeful?
Good.
That is a great question. Certainly, if you watch SportsCenter these days, you wouldn't probably see a lot of hope there. One of the reasons I am hopeful is because I've been doing a lot of work the last 2 years in the film industry. One of the stories that I produced is in development to become a film, and so I've learned a lot through this process. And one of the things that's interesting to me is a lot of film studios, I know this doesn't apply directly to sports, but bear with me. A lot of studios are developing faith-based units. Sony, Paramount, Fox, they all now have a unit dedicated to developing faith-based films. And because they are recognizing that there is an interest in the culture in those things. And so films like God Is Not Dead, Miracles from Heaven, there's another one coming out right now, I can't remember the name. But the most important thing that you can do if you want to grow this hope is to go see these movies when they come out. They may not be the most well-done movies because they are operating on a small budget, but I can guarantee you that Hollywood executives, very few of whom are Christians, are gauging the box office numbers, because if they see that these movies are being successful, that they're exceeding their budgets or their investments, they will continue to put them out because it's a numbers game for them. And so anytime I see a faith-based movie, I immediately go buy a ticket. It might be poorly done, but it's going to lead to better things and bigger things being done because of it. And so similarly, if you see something on television that that touches you, that gives you cause for hope or moment for pause, I would encourage you, if there's a way, to express that's happened, because editors, managers, they don't have any other way to measure interest other than viewer responses. And so I know when I do a story, if I get a couple hundred or 100 emails saying that this touched me, this whatever this content, this theme was, well then that alerts a manager to say people are interested in this.
Good. Great question. Chris, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just want to say, I think there always will be a place for stories like that, like some of the stories Lisa showed. They won't be the most dominant types of stories, but there'll be a place. And I do think, to echo what she said, we speak with our pocketbooks. If we tune out certain stories, if we show that we're displeased with so much that they're showing now, that'll have an effect, because at the end of the day, it's about the bottom line. So.
Good. Let's go back to the left over here and say your name, if you would, please.
My name's Carter, and I'm a senior here at Baylor. Thanks so much for being here. To preface my question, my dear family friend of mine, who I consider like a younger brother, was recently drafted actually to the New York Rangers out by you. And I was just kind of wondering what sort of biblical community do you see in professional sports for athletes developing? And because I imagine it's probably going to be pretty tough for him, where there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily living and are about that life. But then again, if he goes to church in Manhattan, it's, oh, hey, there's a guy on the Rangers. And also in your own personal experience of being people that are known nationally, is it more difficult to connect with other Christians based off of that, or people just kind of get over it? What does community look like for someone working?
I actually think that in professional sports, there's a pretty good support system for Christians. If you're on a team that has a few other Christians. I mean, I'm not sure about hockey, but baseball, football, and basketball, they have chapel before every game. I've spoken at the New York Giants chapels. So if you, I've talked to some of the LA Dodgers, and they've got several, Clayton Kershaw, Adrian Gonzalez. They have several guys on that team who are Christians, and they're able to provide a support system for each other. And so now if you're the only guy on your team that's a Christian, that could be a little bit more of a challenge. But overall, I think sports is like the general society in terms of how many are Christians versus how many aren't. But because you're with your teammates all the time, if there are a decent number who are Christians, and there are usually a few on each team, then you do have that support system that you might not have just in your normal everyday life. As far as church, there are a lot of athletes in New York. Hillsong Church had a lot of Knicks, a lot of professional football players go there. And so that would be a church that, Pastor Carl Lentz, that'd be a church that I think he would probably enjoy. It's a lot of young people there. And like I said, a lot of professional athletes go to that church. So, I think he can find that support system if he likes.
Thanks, Carter. Back over here.
My name is Matthew Cothran. I'm a freshman here at Baylor University. And first off, I just wanted to thank you, Ms. Fenn, because I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And the Chris Paul story was one that really resonated with me and my family and our faith.
Get closer to the mic, okay?
Sorry, I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So I thanked Mrs. Fenn for sharing the Chris Paul story because that really resonated with me and my family and our faith. And secondly, Mr. Broussard, I don't know if your phone showed this, but I would like to report to you that the future NBA star Harry Giles committed to Duke University about an hour ago. And I'm a huge Duke fan, second only to Baylor, of course. So I thought that's interesting. But I would like to hear your comments, maybe personal stories in ways that you've experienced some encouragement from athletes, whether it's in the NBA or just any sort of athlete that you've come across who has a encouraging faith story that has helped your own personal testimony.
Interesting.
Well, when the Jason Collins episode occurred, man, I got a ton of support from players, coaches, and management within the league. Guys just, I walk in the locker room and players thanking me, saying that they didn't agree with the way people were trying to take me down. And it really, and even outside of sports, I mean, I actually got support from Muslims, Jews, Christians throughout the world. It really emboldened a lot of Christians to see that I'm, first of all, still employed at ESPN. But every arena I go into, people come up to me of all races, of all ages, both genders, and they just thank me, for standing up and saying that. So that was encouraging. And then there are a lot of players, Clayton Kershaw, meeting him, talking with him. He's incredibly humble. He's so humble, it's like he doesn't know how good he is, really. But it comes from his faith in Christ. Steph Curry he might be the best player in the world right now, him and LeBron James. But he really is a strong Christian. And so when you see guys that are able to live within the temptation that comes, and the guy before, I should have brought that up. I mean, it's a ton of temptation, obviously. That guys that are able to live within the midst of that and still be true to Christ is always inspiring.
I don't run in professional circles anymore. It's been quite a few years since I've covered professional sports, so I can't really identify an athlete that encouraged me. Certainly when I did find ones who are able to withstand that temptation, I was also, filled with hope and emboldened as well. But I'm not sure I think Chris had probably had the better answer to that question.
All right, thank you very much.
Good, Matthew. Well, I hate to have to do this, and with a compelling subject like this, and two people who are really giving very thoughtful answers, there's going to be more questions than there are time to answer them. So we actually have to stop right now. I'm sorry to do that, but Chris and Lisa will both be here, and will be available at least for a few more minutes after this time, and so you can pursue them. Why don't we put our hands together for both Chris and Lisa?